All right, better late than never. Here is our lesson on nuclear power. And this meme just kind of expresses my feelings when I first learned what nuclear power was and the fact that, yeah, we're just using nuclear power and harnessing this incredibly powerful energy source, boil water. All right, so before we get into this, let's talk about nuclear fission, which is the process that makes nuclear power possible. Fission is the splitting of atomic nuclei. This has to happen with, well, this is easiest to do with radioactive elements. So that is not something that is easy to do with, say like a normal carbon atom or a normal oxygen atom. This is easiest to do with a radioactive atom. Basically, it's got an unstable nucleus, can break apart easily, but what you basically do is you shoot a neutron or a small particle at this radioactive atom. That causes the nucleus to split into two and then release a few other things, neutrons, smaller nuclei, and most importantly of all, energy. And it's that heat energy that's most relevant to us in electricity generation. So that's the thermal energy that's used to make electricity. Now, these kinds of reactions, as long as you control them properly, are self-sustaining. So notice that this diagram has a chain reaction happening. These neutrons that are released as a part of nuclear fission are going to go and hit other nuclei. In this case, we're looking at a uranium-235 nucleus. And when it hits that nucleus, it's going to cause it to split, which is going to release those smaller nuclei that aren't really important to us, the heat energy, as well as other neutrons. And this keeps happening over and over. So that if you do this in a controlled manner, you can have this nice controlled release of heat energy that you can then harness. The most common fuel for nuclear power generation is uranium 235 or plutonium 239. Now, when you are mining uranium, it's usually not super concentrated. There are areas where you can get uranium ore, which is, a little more concentrated than normal, but you still have to enrich the uranium or concentrate it before you can use it as a fuel source because you need relatively pure uranium samples in order to be able to produce a nice self-sustaining reaction. So let's talk how this is used to generate electricity. This diagram should look very familiar from everything after this nuclear reactor because it's our straight up, simple, general method of electricity production where you're generating some sort of flowing fluid, in this case steam. That steam spins a turbine. That turbine spinning spins a generator, and that's what produces electricity. So what you do differently here is you have your uranium sample. So here's your U-235. That's your uranium. And it is induced to undergo fission. So you're going to basically shoot some neutrons at it. And then those fuel rods, because they're usually put in there in the form of rods, are going to start to undergo nuclear fission, which releases heat energy. That heat energy is then transferred here to an exchanger, which is just going to heat water. It heats water that can then take its kinetic energy over to a turbine and use it to spin a generator and produce electricity. Then that steam is then moved to a condenser, which is going to bring in some cool water from an outside source to help absorb that heat. And then it's going to condense back into liquid water, which can then be put into the heat exchanger again over here. And that will allow it to absorb more heat, turn into steam, and kind of cycle through this water use. The large structures that you're probably used to thinking of as part of a nuclear power plant, the ones that are kind of shaped like a weird vase, those are actually not nuclear reactors, those are cooling towers. And their entire purpose is to cool the water that was used to condense steam back into liquid water. It's not radioactive, it's not come in direct contact with radioactive material, so that water vapor is free to release into the air. Then there is potentially an issue if you take this water that has absorbed heat and you don't cool it down properly, and you try to put it into a nearby river or stream or body of water. That can be a problem and that can cause thermal pollution, which is heat pollution. Excess heat in your water can lead to die offs of local fish, aquatic wildlife, etc. So let's take a look at the energy transformations that are taking place here. You start out in the nuclear reactor with nuclear energy that's being released by that fission process. It's then transferred into thermal energy or heat energy, which is used to create steam. That steam is then carrying kinetic energy from this whole thing over to the turbine to turn the generator, which is going to produce electric energy. So it's all a bunch of energy conversions that are happening until we can finally get to our preferred form of energy, electric energy. There are different types of reactions you can have happen with nuclear reactions. You want to have a critical reaction. This is a stable, constant nuclear reaction that will happen until you basically use up your food supply fuel supply, my bad. The key point here is that it's stable in a constant rate of reaction so that you're not releasing all of your energy at once. That would be really hard to harness. If you had all of your energy being released at once, that would be a supercritical reaction where the reaction speeds up exponentially, and that would mean you'd have a nuclear weapon on your hand, which would not be good for producing electricity. So, how do you get to a critical reaction as opposed to a supercritical reaction? You use something called a control rod. So, there are a number of control rods that are, you can insert them into the fuel rod assembly so you can kind of lower them down into the fuel rods, or if you need to, you can remove them from the fuel rods, and they absorb some of the extra neutrons that are helping to continue this chain reaction. When you absorb them, so when you insert these control rods into what mixed with the fuel rods, they absorb more neutrons and they slow down the nuclear reaction. When you remove the control rods, that lets more neutrons bounce around and keep this reaction going, which will then allow you to speed up the nuclear reaction. So you can kind of speed up and slow down based on how fast the reaction's progressing. And this is theoretically a control that if you're approaching meltdown, you could absorb the control rods all the way and hopefully absorb a lot of the neutrons and slow down the nuclear reaction so you don't have a nuclear meltdown. In the reactor building, this is where you have the fuel rods, which are here. You have your control rods, which can be raised or lowered and to mix in with the fuel rods. And this is the only area of the actual power plant that's going to become contaminated with radioactive material, which is important for talking about waste disposal. So this contains the nuclear fuel rods that are kind of interwoven or intermixed with control rods. The reactor tends to be surrounded by pressurized water or liquid metal, helps absorb any stray particles that might be kind of, exiting the nuclear material. And then that heat that's produced by the fission is going to heat water, it's passed on to the heat exchanger to create steam. And then that's going to turn the turbine and turn the generator. So, what are some of the environmental impacts? Well, the big one is radioactive waste. Radioactive waste releases radiation that can cause cancer, mutations, and death in humans and in other organisms. You can break radioactive waste down into three categories based on how long it will be radioactive. You have low level waste. Makes up a large portion of the volume of radioactive waste. About 90% of the volume is this low level waste that will decay quickly and not need too much time to become safe for organisms to be around. Intermediate waste is going to have a higher concentration of radioactivity and it is going to require some shielding. It's going to take longer to decay. You're going to have to store it someplace where the radiation doesn't escape for a bit of time. And then a small portion contains the vast majority of the radioactivity in nuclear waste. This is high level waste. It's very radioactive. It's usually hot, like physically hot, temperature hot. So not only does it need to be shielded so it doesn't release radioactivity, it also needs to be cooled down too. Otherwise, if you don't cool it down properly, a very hot material can melt through things, including the rock you're trying to store this in later. So this stuff can take millions of years to decay, and it's the stuff that needs to be stored long term so it doesn't interact with the biosphere and risk damaging organisms. So this is just a picture showing some cooling high level radioactive waste. These are spent or used fuel rods. The fuel has been used up. You dunk them in a pool of water to help them cool down. And then once they have stopped emitting as much radioactivity and once they have cooled down in temperature, you can then put them in dry storage somewhere. So, where do you put that radioactive waste once you're done with it? Well, the most common plan for that is to bury it deep underground. So, you take your spent fuel or other radioactive material, you stick it, you completely cover it in a copper canister that you then cover with clay, that you then dump in cement, that you then bury deep underground. So, here is like 500 meters underground where you have this radioactive waste disposed of. You have to pick areas carefully. They need to be areas that aren't going to experience a lot of earthquakes or things like that. You ideally want to put these in solid rock that is impermeable, meaning that water can't pass through it because you don't want water to like leach in and damage the storage containers and then start carrying radioactive material out. Um, there are some countries that have started to dispose of their radioactive waste like this. I believe Finland is pretty close to completing their deep disposal site, so they should be able to bury their radioactive waste soon. The problem is, it needs to be kept safe for, in some cases, millions of years and away from living organisms. Oh, apologies, I forgot there was more writing on here. So, what you do to store the waste before you stick it in that copper canister is you actually mix it in with liquid glass. When the glass solidifies, it can help absorb some of the radioactivity. So you're basically trying to shield this stuff so less radioactivity escapes it and give it time to kind of decay on its own. Now, nuclear power is not always without its risks. There have been multiple nuclear accidents. We're going to talk about the three major ones that happen to have been the most recent in time. So, the most recent one was in Fukushima in Japan. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name of the plant, but it was in Fukushima Daiichi. This happened in March 11th of 2011. So many of you were alive during this time, though you may not have been paying attention to the news. I actually was paying attention to the news at that time because I was, pretty old and remember hearing about this on the news. So a tsunami happened off the coast of Japan because there was an underwater earthquake. So deep under the ocean, an earthquake happened. It displaced a lot of water, caused a tsunami, and that tsunami was powerful enough that when it hit that city in Japan, it disabled not only the power supply, but it also disabled the cooling systems of the nuclear reactors. Because of that, you had some partial meltdown and a release of radioactive contaminants and radioactive material into the air. So this is showing kind of the release of some of the gases. And then this map right here is showing you within 3 days the cloud of radioactive material spread over the Pacific. Within 6 days, it started to reach like the Pacific Northwest coast. So this is Alaska, this is Canada, and here is the US, continental US. So within 10 days, the big worry was that cloud of radioactive material was going to reach the western states in the United States, and people were very concerned about how that would impact people's health. About 164,000 people were displaced, evacuated from the area right after the incident, though I think many of them they've been able to resettle back in the area. There has been one death linked to the exposure to radioactive material, and a lot of the radioactive material is thought to have just fallen out of the atmosphere into the Pacific Ocean. And people have been measuring the radioactivity, the surface level radioactivity in the Pacific Ocean, trying to figure out what the impact has been on marine life. And it seems like it's not raised the radioactivity level of the ocean very much. So hopefully it's not having a very large impact. The most famous of all the nuclear accidents is Chernobyl. This happened in 1986 in the former USSR, which is currently the Ukraine. I was alive during this, but I was only 4, so I was not paying attention. Actually, I was 3. But what happened is a couple of things. People made mistakes, and it was bad reactor design with badly designed safety systems. So while they were actually trying to test a safety system, that caused an accident that led to some steam explosions. There was a meltdown. It destroyed the entire containment building for one of the reactors, and the reactor core caught on fire. The airborne radioactive contaminants actually spread throughout the USSR and throughout a lot of Europe. So this diagram right here is showing you how the radiation dose increased across Europe within a week. And so you see there was a large amount of radiation exposure, or there was a massive increase in, or a larger increase in radiation levels around in the immediate area surrounding Chernobyl, but it reached as far as Italy, Spain, Portugal, Great Britain. So all of those areas experienced some increase in background radiation levels. Now, on site, 30 people were killed, and about 134 were confirmed within 4 or 5 years to have acute radiation syndrome, which, is associated with increased risk of cancer and other things. About 120,000 people were evacuated from the immediate area, 30-kilometer wide exclusion zone, and people are still not allowed to live in the immediate area today. Some of the environmental impacts: animals and plants in the immediate area died soon after from the radiation exposure. In fact, this picture up here is what's called the Red Forest. It was a forest area right around Chernobyl that the plants ended up dying and taking on this kind of copperish reddish hue, and the whole forest died. Then people have gone back to study some of the effects of that long-term radiation exposure, and some of the things they've noticed are the organisms living in that area do have a higher than normal rate of mutation, and there may be some increases in like birth defects and decreases in like the health or reproductive success of some of the organisms. So long-term environmental impacts. 3 Mile Island was the most distant in the past. I was actually not alive for this one, so I uh, didn't hear as much about it, especially growing up. This happened in Pennsylvania in the United States. So this map is of Pennsylvania. Here you see Philadelphia on one end and Pittsburgh on the other end, and almost smack in the middle was the 3 Mile Island power plant. So there were some mechanical failures as well as some operator error. So in Chernobyl and in 3 Mile Island, there were definitely people making mistakes. Fukushima, it seems like it was mostly just the strength of the tsunami was stronger than the safety systems were built to designed to withstand. And so what happened in 3 Mile Island was the coolant system failed, and that led to a partial meltdown of the reactor. It did result in the release of some radioactive gases and some radioactive iodine. There wasn't a mandatory evacuation. Instead, there was a voluntary evacuation. About 140,000 people chose to leave. I know they recommended that like young children and pregnant women leave the area, but they didn't make people leave the area. So far, there have been no recorded deaths that are directly linked to the radiation exposure from 3 Mile Island, and there hasn't been any confirmed environmental impact. The reports that I was reading stated that there isn't a very significant increase in the amount of radioactivity in those areas. So I'm hopeful for the people of Pennsylvania. So let's talk about why it takes time for radioactive material to no longer be dangerous. This is due to something called a half-life. So, this is the amount of time it takes for half of the radioactive material in a sample to decay, break down, and no longer be radioactive. Once it's no longer radioactive, once it's broken down into non-radioactive materials, then it's not going to be dangerous for organisms to be around. So, all it takes is time. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a very long time. So if you look at this chart on the right, you'll see some things have a very short half-life. For example, polonium 218 has a half-life of mere minutes. Polonium 214 has a half-life of seconds. But something like uranium 238 has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, which is basically the amount of time that the Earth has been in existence. So depending on what isotope or version of an element you have, that it may require longer times to decay. And then you can use this concept of the half-life to calculate how much of a radioactive sample will be left behind. This requires using math, of course, and I'm going to do a sample problem on the next slide. Just wanted to point out a graph here. So on the x-axis, we have the number of half-lives. In this case, this element, cobalt, has a half-life of 5.27 years. So this one half-life represents 5.27 years passing. This two half-lives is 2 times 5.27. So that would be a little over 10 and a half. Then here you have 3 half-lives. That would be 3 times 5.27. And then you'll see what happens to the amount of cobalt during that time. So if you start this with 100% of your cobalt being 10 grams, after one half-life, you're going to go down to 5 grams. Half of it's going to be left. After another half-life, the amount that's remaining is going to be cut in half again. So half of 5 is 2.5. Then after another half-life, the amount remaining is going to be cut in half again. So half of 2.5 is 1.25. And it keeps going and going until eventually the last radioactive atom decays, though that may take quite a long time. So here's a sample problem. It's not one of the ones we did in class, so if you want to go through it, not a problem. So it says a soil sample near Chernobyl was found to contain 187 I think that's I don't know how to pronounce the unit. It's not as important. It's kBq per meter squared of cesium-137. They're telling you it has a half-life, cesium-137, so you know it's radioactive, and they tell you the half-life is 30 years. Also, 187 units of radioactivity is there, or that's how much is there. So they want to know how much cesium-137 will remain in this sample after 90 years. So the first thing to keep in mind is you need to know how long the half-life is. Technically, we're not going to use a formula, but I'm lazy, so I'm going to write T1 half is the symbol for half-life. And for this element, it's 30 years. What was our original amount? Well, we started with 187. And keep in mind, if you're doing this on the AP test, you will need to include units. So I'm going to write down the units. And then the amount of time we're looking at is 90 years. So the first thing I do is I figure out how many half-lives we're looking at. So within 90 years, how many times or how many 30-year periods will you have? So you take 90 years and you divide it by 30 years. That's going to give you 3 half-lives. All right, so that means you're going to cut 187 kBq per meter squared. You're going to cut it in half 3 times. So times 1 half, times 1 half, times 1 half. And that's going to give you a final answer of oops, sorry. 23.375 kBqs per meter squared. So that's how much you'll have left after 90 years. If you need more help with half-life problems, come see me in class or during tutoring. So what are the pros and cons ultimately of nuclear power? Well, the advantages, it gives you a lot of energy per amount of fuel. And so you can get a lot of energy from a small amount of nuclear material. It doesn't have a lot of direct environmental impacts. The big one is it is not going to release CO2 or air pollution, which is, of course, the big issue with fossil fuels. I just said. If you have the security systems in place, then that can decrease the risk of having a nuclear accident. Now, the disadvantages costs a lot to start up. You're going to have to invest a lot in building a nuclear power plant. There is the chance of catastrophic environmental damage if an accident occurs. The big example of that is Chernobyl. Entire cities had to be relocated because people could no longer live in their homes. There is a problem with removal and storage of waste products, although some countries, especially in Europe, actually have a way to recycle some of their nuclear waste or their spent nuclear fuel and get more power out of it. In the United States, we don't do that. And then also when you decommission an old plant, when a plant outlives its lifespan and is no longer usable, then some of the elements of it, especially in the reactor building, have become radioactive and will need to be disposed of properly as well. And another big risk, if you have countries that are saying they're developing nuclear power, but if they have ties to terrorist organizations, the materials used for nuclear power can be used and adapted to produce nuclear weapons, which is always a risk. So there are international nuclear regulatory organizations that are supposed to monitor and make sure that if a country has nuclear material, nuclear fuel like uranium, that they're not enriching it for weapons production. They're just using it to produce nuclear power and electricity. And then the biggest disadvantage, there is a finite supply of fissionable elements that we can use for nuclear power. So we have about 90 years worth of nuclear material left if we continue to use it at current rates. So it is not a renewable resource. Again, it is non-renewable because once we use up the uranium we have that's easily accessible, there's nowhere to get anymore. There's a finite amount on the planet. All right, that concludes this lesson. Sorry it was a little longer.